Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Tonight we're live from Townsville, the city and region devastated by a 1 in 500-year flood just 6 weeks ago. We're broadcasting tonight from Townsville Basketball Stadium because traditional venues like the Civic and the Convention Centres are still flood damaged. It was great to be here and we'll be highlighting the challenges facing Townsville and other regional communities confronting extreme weather. We're on the panel, the Minister for Emergency Management and North Queensland Recovery, Linda Reynolds. Environmental scientist Stephen Williams, one of the hundreds of graziers affected by the devastating floods, Jane McMillan, the local Labor MP, Cathy O'Toole, and rural property valuer, Roger Hill. Please welcome our panel. Thank you very much. Now, Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV iView and News Radio. Our first question comes from here in the stadium. It's from Thomas Stokes.
Fraser Anning's comments this week were despicable, but he's hardly the only politician to exploit Islamophobia for votes. Pauline Hanson constantly spread hate. North Queensland's George Christensen has attended anti-Islamic rallies and events. And even our Prime Minister has reportedly sought to use anti-Muslim sentiment for political gain. So my question is, with this kind of rhetoric, do our leaders bear some responsibility for the rise in recent Australian Islamophobia?
Linda Reynolds, start with you.
Well, Thomas, thank you for that question, and I know it's something that's on the minds of all Australians today in terms of what happened and how that terrible atrocity could have occurred in Christchurch at the hands, it looks like, of an Australian. The first thing I would say is that now is a time for grieving. It is a time for support to everybody in New Zealand, to our Kiwi and Anzac brothers and sisters. It is also a time for all of us in politics to come together. It is not the time for anybody in this country, be a politician, be a commentator, be anybody in the Australian community, to try and make cheap political points out of this issue. I was so proud over the last couple of days to see our nation's leaders come together, to see our leaders in the Senate come together in a bipartisan way, and I would call on all of my Senate colleagues to support the censure motion of Fraser Anning, because what he said and what he physically did have absolutely no place in our country.
Should he be thrown out of the parliament?
Well, that's an issue for Queensland voters in 2 months. I call on all of my colleagues in the Senate to censure him. We can't ourselves throw him out, but every single Queensland voter can ensure that he does not return to this Senate. Because as the Prime Minister of New Zealand said so beautifully and so eloquently yesterday, what happened in Christchurch is not New Zealand. And equally, I think, and I'm certain, it is also not Australia. So Australian authorities are working very closely with the New Zealand authorities to do everything they can here in Australia, New Zealand and elsewhere he may have been to find out what happened. But all of us here have to stand up for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and I've been incredibly proud of the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, because I know there is no stronger champion for religious freedoms in our parliament than Scott Morrison. Every Australian, I'll finish on this, every Australian must have the right to exercise peacefully and practice their own religions.
Now, you mentioned Scott Morrison, and the question was about the politics, what's been said in advance of this and whether politicians have inflamed anti-Islamic feelings. You'd know the Prime Minister's called for an apology from Waleed Ali because of a speech that he made on his program, The Project, on Friday. Do you agree that he's deserved an apology?
Well, look, as I said, I think that now is the time for very cool heads. It is a time for no politician or no commentator in this country to try and make political gain, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. What happened was completely unacceptable, and I applaud my Senate colleagues for taking the action in a bipartisan way against Fraser Anning and what he said and what he did. So in terms of pointing the finger in a partisan political way, now is not the time for that. It
Cathy,
really is not.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Cathy O'Toole.
Thank you, Tony. Firstly, can I say it's great to be here on traditional owners' land, the Wulgurukaba and the Bindal people. My thoughts and prayers are with the families in New Zealand. As Linda said, this is not a time to play politics. This is a time for us to be very compassionate about what has happened in New Zealand to men, women and children who are sitting in their place of prayer, peacefully praying. I went to the mosque last night here on Ross River Road for an interfaith commemoration, and it was amazing. It really was. Several people from our broader community were there to stand in solidarity with our Muslim brothers and sisters here in Townsville. We are the Anzacs. Our men and women fought for the freedoms that we have both here and in New Zealand. What impressed me the most last night was the Imam standing up and saying, we come to this place in love and peace and forgiveness. I was absolutely in awe of the community, my community, that was there last night. This is not the time to play blame game, but this is the time to say, when we hear hate speech, we call it out. It is unacceptable. It does not happen in this country or New Zealand. We are better than this. We are a nation that has been built on immigrants, and we need to value that and be very thankful for that.
I'm just going to go to our next question because, thank you very much. Our next question, I believe, was at that interfaith service, and we'll bring the other panellists in to respond when we hear from Ray Martin. Go ahead, Ray.
Thanks very much, Tony. I'm a former member of the Australian Defence Force, and like thousands of my friends here in Townsville and other veterans around the country, have served in places where immigrants and refugees have either come from or fled. Last night, I also attended that interfaith service at our local mosque, a very impressive service. And we stood there in support of our Anzac mates, the other half of Anzac, our Kiwi friends, of course, their nation, their Muslim community and our own. Isn't it not time that our political discourse is more measured? Interestingly, tonight we've started that way. More measured, and that politicians do not exploit the fear of others, as we have for many years now. And that the mainstream media in particular do not provide a platform for those that would give extreme views, whether they are extreme Islamic views or extreme white supremacist views. Really, now we need more measured discourse. That's what my question is about. Thank you.
Okay, let me start with our non-politicians. Steve, go ahead. Steve Williams.
I guess I was obviously, like everyone else, completely shocked by what happened in New Zealand. And I guess I was almost equally shocked to see an Australian politician get up and say the things that he did. And it just completely blew me away. I guess my only real comment, which is a little bit flippant, I know, but based on the comments that I've seen online, all hail Egg Boy. Because I'll leave it there.
Yeah,
I think
just tell me why you said that, because some people would say, well, that was actually a violent response to the events. Obviously, an egg to the back of the head is not like a punch to the face, which is what he got, but still.
Yeah, not nearly as violent as the response to that. I guess it was just a way of expressing his absolute disgust at something, and not only his disgust at what the guy was promoting, but to do it then. I mean, it's so insensitive that it's just mind-blowing. And so, no, sorry, I completely support him.
Jane.
Thank you. The whole thing, even what's happened in New Zealand, is very distressing, especially when we've got so much distress happening here in our own backyard. And then when we see politicians, who I don't support, and we also see the events of what happened, and our children are reacting in the way they're reacting, it's really disappointing. It's really sad. I'm not sure where we're headed. But I think we're on the right track when we started here tonight, so hopefully we'll move forward.
Roger.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. We've all got children in attending schools, and we go to work every day and you expect to come home that night. You go to a place of prayer, you expect to pray, have your peace and your moment to touch base with yourself. Change comes from up top. Cultural change is driven by the top. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining that tonight. I think you've all made good comments.
Can I just go back to Ray Martin? Ray, I'm intrigued, in fact, by your question and the context in which you put it. You said that politicians should not exploit the fear of others for political gain, as they have in the past. What are you talking about?
Well, I think really, you look back to Tampa, children overboard and issues like that, really for a generation now, sadly. Every election time, we start talking about immigration, border security and those things. They are important issues, but sadly, they've now been couched almost for a generation around others. So it concerns me as an individual that our kind of political class has used that centrally in our discussion. And really, this highlighted last weekend, and terrorism is not restricted by border, race or religion. I also served in the UK when terrorist incidents were occurring. So all I'm doing is pleading really for a more reasonable debate, and that we really leave that kind of rhetoric out of the debate. I think the New Zealand Prime Minister at the moment is giving an incredible example of how to speak moderately, in moderation, and really with compassion. And also her security services, their own police commissioner, and indeed our own security services here talk in measured tones. We need that, I think, from our parliament across all sides.
Cathy O'Toole.
I think as a nation, we are measured by the standard we walk past. And from that perspective, the media absolutely has a role to play. But so do we as citizens in this city. So do we in terms of the conversations we have in our homes, the conversations we have with our children. It's not just about the political leaders. It's also about taking the time to understand your neighbour. Talk to people of different faiths and different communities. Get to know them. The people that I was with last night, those people came here because Australia offered them a better life. They say openly, we are the lucky country. So certainly our political voice needs to be much more measured and much more bipartisan. But we as citizens have a role to play in this as well. I think it's top down, bottom up, side to side. Remember that we are measured by the standard we walk past, and we are a much better nation than what we have seen in past times.
So, Cathy O'Toole, what do you say to the point that Ray Martin is making, that for a long time politicians have used the fear of others for political purposes?
Well, it would be very foolish of me to sit here and say that that's not true. But I think this incident, if it has done nothing else, has drawn our attention to the consequences of the words and the actions that we take. We need to be much more mindful. Our young people deserve far better role models. Our young people are thinking young people. The young people that I talk to, they value and welcome diversity in their community. They learn from it. Children, when they're born, they don't see colour, they don't know hate. They learn it. And it's our responsibility as the federal government, state government, local government, citizens of this community, to take our role seriously and be conscious of what we say and do, and understand everything we say and do has a consequence. So we need to be much more measured.
Now, Linda Reynolds, I know you don't want to talk about politics, but we mentioned Waleed Ali's speech, and what he was essentially accusing the Prime Minister of was plotting in the shadow cabinet some time ago to use the fear of Islam and Muslims for political purposes. Do you want to respond to that?
I do, but I don't want to do it, as we've said, in a political way tonight. I would caution all commentators and all politicians, as I said earlier, is to be very careful with your words. And Ray, thank you very much for your comments, because I think you are spot on, and I support what Cathy has said.
So do you agree with Ray Martin that fear of others has been used for political purposes?
Well, Tony, this is a very personal issue for me, and the circumstances that you were talking about, Ray, are things that I've lived through. And last month I gave probably the hardest and the most personal speech I've ever given in the Senate. And it was in response to the Labor's amendments to the Medivac bill. And I was literally almost physically ill when I saw some of my Senate and House of Reps colleagues in the chamber cheering and high-fiving the passage of these amendments, because I was one of the few in that chamber who has lived through terrorism and the impact of, up in the Bali bombings. I was up there, I saw, I smelt, and I got to understand the commodification of human beings. There are people in our own nation, and there are people overseas who want to do us harm. They don't respect our compassion, and they certainly do not respect our way of life. And
can
all
I
the
just
things
interrupt
Cathy
you
was
there? Are
talking
you
about.
drawing some kind of link between the Bali bombings and refugees coming to Australia for medical services?
What I'm saying is that having my colleagues cheer for this policy that will inevitably lead to the boat trade coming again. I mean, there are thousands of people up in near north who people smugglers don't see them as human beings, they see them as commodities to profit from. And I saw that firsthand in 2001 and 2002. And I saw the consequences on those who were desperate enough to pay to come here. And they drowned the most horrendous deaths. And it happened again when Labor opened the borders, and there's at least 1,200 people that we know drowned. And for me, that is not compassion. Encouraging people to be commoditised, not by will, but to come here and to drown again. Because as a member of the armed forces here in Australia, who is it who has to recover those bodies out of the water both of the times in the past? It's not me, and it's not politicians. It's the men and women in uniform. It's our Customs and Border Force people who are still waking up with night terrors. So in the Parliament, we have a responsibility to think about the consequences of the policies we implement. So my point is this, Tony, is that there are people out there who commoditise other human beings, and whether they exploit them for some perversion of religion or left or right ideology, or whether they just simply commoditise them and send them off to drown, they are people who do not deserve our respect or our compassion. They are people we have to stand up to and stop. But we absolutely have to reserve our compassion for those who are genuine refugees, and like we have always in this country, we have brought people in who genuinely need our help.
Can I just note one thing? You didn't really answer the question about whether or not you'd be disturbed if you discovered that the current Prime Minister had, while in shadow cabinet, tried to use...
The Prime Minister has come out very... As I said, I didn't want to politicise this, but the Prime Minister has been very clear tonight. It did not happen. It simply did not happen. And my bigger point is for anybody to try and politicise this issue now, while events are still unfolding in New Zealand, is inappropriate and tacky.
All right. Look, we came here to talk about the natural disasters that affected this region. Obviously, the human disaster, the tragedy in Christchurch has taken us a little off course, but let's go to where we wanted to begin. The next question was recorded earlier via Skype. It's from Patrick Scarf in Bells Creek, Queensland.
Yeah, hi. The flood of Townsville in northwestern Queensland had decimated cattle stocks, family livelihoods and industry. Will this weather event affect the values of properties and land out west in regards to being able to source loans from banks and other financial institutions to restock and rebuild? We know there are grants and low interest loans available, but most people will need a lot more than bricks and mortar. Homes and cattle are gone. There's some places there's just nothing left. Money only goes so far. What is the Queensland Government and the Australian Government, for that matter, doing to ensure that these farmers and families are looked after now and in the years ahead?
Okay, Patrick Scarf, that is. Now, Patrick couldn't come here. He's too far away and he's got bigger problems on his mind. Jane, can you start by telling us what it is he's talking about?
Yeah, so, Patrick, I'll just going to fill in a little bit further there. So the beef industry is really on its knees, and the reason why is because at the beginning of February we had a rain event. We had 650 mils approximately that fell in the northwest. It fell over a period of 9 days. At first, everyone was excited. It was going to rain. We had been in drought. We've had droughts now, continuous droughts for 7 or 8 years. This was an exciting thing. It continued to rain. It didn't stop raining, and it kept raining, and then everyone started to panic. The wind started, it was cold, the clouds came down. I had a daughter, a young daughter in her early 20s, who was stuck at home for 9 days on her own with no other humans. Helicopters couldn't fly. We couldn't send anyone in to see if she was all right. She was talking to us on the phone. It was really serious. She then started to realise that things weren't looking good. She realised that the cattle were dying, and the cattle were dying and no one could get to them because the helicopters couldn't fly.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
So across the northwest, it's an estimated amount. There's about 500,000 head of cattle that have gone. It's an area that spreads from Winton in the south to Normanton in the north. The water that spanned the area was some 80 kilometres wide. That's from here to Ayr in Townsville. And that's a distance between normal towns in normal spaces. So that's the width of the water. The cattle were drowning to the north and they were freezing to the south. There was a low sitting over the whole thing and it was spinning. And for some reason, the cattle became disorientated. They didn't know what to do. So they all headed, they all died and compounded on top of one another in the western fences mainly. And they all piled on top of one another to get warm. Then there was cattle that was standing on their own virtually with all the dead ones around them. They didn't know whether to eat. They couldn't drink. You'd take them to the water. They were perishing. It was just devastating. So these guys out there, they were trying to move their stock. They never slept for 6 days. Their wives, their kids, everyone was involved. This is a natural disaster. The Weather Bureau didn't depict this happening. No one depicted this happening. And Townsville was underwater as well. So the whole thing was just a magnitude of things happening. We do have a few areas that were probably man-made parts of the disaster, which we'll probably move on to later on. But the natural part of the disaster, no one had any control over.
Roger, I'm going to come to you because I know that you were flying your aircraft at this time over some of this, all of these floodlands really, or as much of it I suppose as you could. I heard one helicopter pilot who said he flew for 80 kilometres without seeing a patch of dry land.
He wasn't wrong. There were 13,500,000 hectares affected by this monsoonal event. It's twice the size of Tasmania. It occurred while Tasmania was burning. While Tasmania was burning, Townsville was under flood. When I went out there, look, I was only there for a flash in the pan compared to what the day-to-day men, ringers, head stockmen, managers, overseers, the women of Richmond, sitting there, getting straight in, making sandwiches, looking after everyone just banded together and got right in beside that disaster response group, brilliantly coordinated in every town. The 5 mayors, brilliant, stepped up to the plate and led their communities. The delegation was amazing. It all clicked into gear, but let's just tell you what it looks like. So Ground Zero started flying into Hughenden. You start in there, you fly in, and while everyone was mucking around talking about whether or not the military were there, they were there. There was a Chinook flying out of Hughenden, doing its job. Flying to Richmond, more Chinook activity. Mustering pilots flat out, helicopters coming from everywhere. Australians banding together to help their fellow men. The water is a geographical feature. I'm sure we're probably going to talk about that shortly. But you go past Richmond, past the O'Connell Creek. At that point, Ground Zero kicks in and a bend in the Alec Creek when it flows into the Rupert Creek, flows east-west. Alec Creek flows east-west. And they just converge and they hit the Flinders. That's the Max Welton and Nonda area across to Nelia. You saw it on the news. You saw the photos. It's harrowing to see it.
What were you seeing yourself flying above this? Because the extent of the death of cattle, but other animals, kangaroos, virtually every animal that walked or breathed was killed.
Yeah, look, you're spot on. Budgerigars. as well. You know, it wasn't just kangaroos. Things that flew died. That's how bad it was. And then, you know, when you ring a mate to check, all I was doing was out there just checking on a couple of mates. And you ring him and you say, how are you going today? And he said, well, I've worked out how to feed these cattle and keep them on the little bit of gravel road that I've got, because if they step off either side, they bog and they're too weak to walk back up onto that road. So all he worked out to do was undo the tailgate of his Toyota, roll a bale of hay out, nowhere near those cattle. Just sneak up, roll it out and drive away, and they would come down that bitumen road and find it themselves. As far as the deaths of cattle, when you started going across the Jane's territory there, that was incredible to see the corners. And as Jane said, they were disorientated. The tracks from the sky, helicopters all talked about it. They didn't go in straight lines. They were aimlessly just wandering through the mud.
I'm going to go talk about the government response to this in a minute, because that was obviously canvassing the question. But Steve, you're a climate scientist. How does this event look to you?
Well, it's obviously a completely devastating natural event. The sad part about it, though, is that we've been basically saying it was going to happen for 30 years. The climate science has been predicting an increase in extreme events, and Roger alluded to some of them. We had like catastrophic wildfires in one part of the country. We had record-breaking heat waves across all of the country just about. We've had the hottest summer on record. We've had the hottest year on record. My son, who's 18, has 17 of his 18 years have been the hottest records on year for the globe. I mean, there is just simply no denying the climate change impacts and the fact that we are causing them, and that it has been predicted for decades now that we would start seeing increasing heat waves, increasing flood events of, you know, massive, immense flood events, increasing catastrophic fires, killer heat waves. The last summer has been a great example of that, because it is basically we've been getting all of them simultaneously. Now, it's impossible to just point at one particular event and say the Townsville flood was caused by climate change. You can't do that. But you can look at the fact that those kind of events, and not just the floods, the heat waves, the cyclones, the fires and so forth, have been steadily increasing, right along with the predictions that have been made now for several decades.
It's difficult to ask this in a quick way, but what is it that causes a low-pressure system of this intensity to stay put for 9 days over one region?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I was actually looking at something just recently about that, and it's very tricky to relate it to the climate change, but basically the theory is that a high-pressure system blocks the low-pressure system and basically maintains it in exactly the same position, and that's mainly due to a kind of a global slowing down of the sort of the circulation currents of the whole world. And that goes for both the atmospheric currents and also the ocean currents. Now, there's recorded evidence of all of those things starting to slow down with climate change. And so the idea is that basically it's that slowing down which is causing these things to sit.
Do you fear, as a scientist, you said you predicted this would come, so this is a 1 in 500 year event, it's been called. Do you expect to see more of them?
Absolutely.
There's no way to predict how quickly, but you expect
there's no way to predict when the next one will be. But if you look at, I guess the indicators of temperature are much more reliable and much more easy to predict than a rainfall, especially in Australia. I mean, it has just been bang, bang, bang. It's one year after another. It's like 200 climate records broken. And I said the same thing last year. I teach a course on climate change, and I told the students how many records were broken in the previous year, and then this year I just tell them all again, because they were all the ones from last year would have been broken again. And as I said, the last 4 years have been the hottest 4 years ever. So yeah, it's going to continue, unless we can do something about it.
We are going to come back to talk about that in more detail. But Linda, for you, the first question is the one that was asked, which is what can the government do? Money is not enough. It's not just about money, is what the questioner was saying.
Look, you're absolutely right, Patrick. It's not just about money. And my responsibility as the Federal Minister for Emergency Management is essentially two things. First of all is to make sure that when these natural disasters occur, whether it's in out of the Huon Valley or up here in Queensland, the Central Queensland fires, or these horrific floods here, my first responsibility is to work with the Prime Minister to make sure that the Commonwealth Government does everything that it can, that within its responsibilities to deliver, and that's exactly what we've done. And can I just give a huge shout out to a number of people in relation to this response. I think that this has been the quickest response from the Commonwealth Government. We've had two joint task forces from the military. Here we had a joint task force with 2,300 Defence Force personnel, and I think many of you here in this room, some of you may actually be serving, or you would have actually seen them out and about, but they were out there providing all the response, support that they could during the floods and after the floods. Quite often when their own families were impacted, when their houses had been inundated, and that they were, their own families were in some of the evacuation centres. But we also had Task Force 646 out in the northwest of Queensland. And just listening to Jane's description of what happened out there has literally given me chills, because the Commonwealth, we were out there straight away, and we had the Defence Force out there. And I went out there for 2 days when the military went in, and I heard all of the stories. And these people, these are some of the toughest, most resilient, wonderful people in Australia we have. But they have, as Jane said, just been knocked around and had the stuffing knocked out of them. So my responsibility is, as I said, firstly, to make sure that we provide that response. But secondly, I've been working very closely with state and territory governments, because I've got no doubt that our climate is changing. But the real issue for me in this role is, what do we do about it? How do we better prepare ourselves as a nation to deal with these climatic incidents, and also make our homes more resilient, make our communities more resilient, and lessen the impact on our economy and of all of you, particularly here in Townsville.
We'll come back to that in more detail in a minute. We've got a question specifically about the government's response. It's from Clancy Cox.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about the measures taken to tailor the disaster relief available to primary producers. Has the government asked the primary producers what they need by way of meaningful assistance? I've been hearing ridiculous stories about the measures that these primary producers and the hoops that they need to jump through to receive this assistance.
Clancy, we might come back to you in a minute. I want to hear from Jane first of all on this. Are you satisfied with the government's response, with the financial side of it, the package, and with how it's being administered?
Okay, so we had the Developing Northern Australia board. We got the white paper. We put the ideas out there. They had meetings all over Australia, and I'm still not sure what we've done from that, Developing Northern Australia. So that's my first challenge. We have now developed another board. I have great faith in this board because I have to.
Is this the board which will administer the funds
advisory board
that the Prime Minister is putting forward, the federal government, what,
yes.
$2 billion?
And so the detail is very close. I believe there may be something said tomorrow. But in saying that, we're looking down the barrel of an election. We're also looking at a number of levels of government to actually get that through. And so therefore, these guys out there, they're hanging on it. The $75,000, it's the paperwork's been filled out. It was forthcoming. It happened quickly. The $5,000 to help clean up, we're very grateful for that. But when you're using a loader and you've got 5 loaders going and you've got a backhoe going as well, plus you've got a bobcat, the $5,000 doesn't go very far, especially when there's 7,000 head of cattle in one strip to clean up.
What about the low-interest loans that are being promised? Because these are meant to be on a very large scale at the same rates the government borrows money at, which is between 2% and 3%. I mean, has that money or any of it started flowing? Do people have any guarantees after 6 weeks that they'll be able to restock or rebuild with money on these low-interest loans?
So, Tony, this is where we're waiting. We're actually sitting with fingers crossed at the moment for the detail tomorrow. We're hoping and we're praying. The other problem with the advisory board, and it's a little distressing, is there's not one significant cattleman from the northwest on that board. So...
why is that?
You tell me.
Well, let me just... Can you briefly respond to that, Linda Reynolds? Because that's a pretty critical one, isn't it? I mean, if these are the people most affected, why are they not on the advisory board?
Well, look, the advisory board was set up by the Prime Minister and it's hit the ground running. So Shane Stone...
Well, it sounds like it's hit the ground with no farmers on it, which is a bit of a problem.
No, there is. There's the mayor of Cloncurry, for example, who was on the board, and he has been integral in the local response. So I think that the board that we've set up is a good mix of people from finance, from rural industry, and Shane Stone himself was the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, and he has very experience with disaster response. But what I would say, Tony, is that we've had a number of... There hasn't just been one silver bullet in this. So the support from the federal government has been initial relief. So we've got over $100 million into the Townsville community through $1,000 grants for people's immediate needs. So it's to make sure they've got shelter, clothes and food. We've also got some allowance. It's a bit similar to New Start allowance for people who can't get to work or their businesses can't pay them. We're also providing in conjunction with the Queensland Government. So it's important to remember that disaster relief and response is the responsibilities in state and territory governments. The federal government has an agreement with all state and territory governments, including the Queensland Government. So we have now enacted measures for 39 local government areas here in Queensland, which is, as you know, is over half of Queensland. And every single local government area has got a slightly different mix of support for primary producers, for small businesses, to make sure that it's tailored. So at the moment, we gave in the first week 75,000 ex gratia payment straight to primary producers, which was to help them with their carcass removal and doing immediate work on their
Linda Reynolds,
farms.
I think, okay, we can accept that's happened.
But Tony, the context is important because that is not the only...
We just heard about announcements being made tomorrow and farmers appear to be waiting to hear about these low interest loans.
Yes.
Can you tell them something now about what's been decided?
I can, and there's a number of things that are going on with the Queensland Government. So there will be an announcement either tomorrow or later this week about the detail of what the North Queensland Livestock Restocking Organisation will do. So Shane Stone has already been out and he's been in Julia Creek, he's been consulting with graziers. What we will do is there's about 800 graziers affected and it's now over 630,000 livestock that have been lost. He will work and his team will work with every single grazier. So there will be a separate, some only need low interest loans, which will be about 1.37%. Others need, we've worked with the banks. So the Prime Minister and the Minister for Finance has worked with the banks to make sure that they don't foreclose on any property for the next 3 years. We've also working through agreements with the banks so that with the assistance of the federal government through the Rural Investment Corporation, to make sure that graziers can get loans to restock, but it's not secured against their property as they've had to do it previously. They can secure their loans for restocking against the stock themselves. We've also put arrangements in place with the Australian Tax Office to make sure that they can work through with every single primary producer, with the graziers, to make sure that they get grace periods so that they don't get hit with tax bills. They can make sure that they get their GST refunds back earlier so that they have breathing space to rebuild, restock. But what I'm saying, Tony, is that there's not just one measure. There is a suite of measures to make sure that every single grazier gets a package of measures that suits their needs.
But I'd like to get a response to the measures you've just talked about, and I want to hear from Jane and from Roger. But Jane, go ahead. You've heard that. I mean, is there anything, does that actually settle your mind, or is there still huge doubt over what's actually being promised?
No, I think we have to be sensible here. This has been a short term, the incident occurred. It has been a very short amount of time, and I think everyone's willing to wait and everyone's reasonable. But in saying that, we have to put forward all the things that are happening as well and what concerns us. So, but we do understand. So the government's on board. People are out there trying to rebuild. They're out there, they're working in 40-degree heat. The flies are thick. We're eating flies like it's gross. And we're building our fences. We're mustering. We're counting our stock. We're trying to put something together so that we know we're weighing up our options. And until that detail comes out, the hope and to be able to build the resilience, this is what we're waiting for.
I've just got to go to Cathy here because it was suggested by Jane there's an election coming up and that creates a certain amount of doubt. If there's a new federal government, will the Labor Party, would a Labor government commit to sticking to or even increasing the amount of aid that's being promised here?
Well, Tony, the first thing I'd like to say is we have established that this is a 1 in a 500-year weather event, or is it? Why do we have so much red tape? I don't live in the bush, so I'm not on the land, but I am dealing with small business every day here. The red tape is horrendous. So having money that it takes you all your life to get to is not helpful. If it's flooded, fund it. It is pretty obvious if you send someone out to have a look at a small business, whether or not it's been flooded and damaged, and in the case of small business here, people need the $50,000 to get on their feet. I have been to, and I'll name 2 small businesses I've been to, 26 employees look like losing their jobs because these small businesses can't get a measly $25,000. This economy is built on small business. These people's jobs matter. Why is it so complicated and so hard? In terms of the $1,000, let me tell you about the $1,000. My office is swamped by people ringing who couldn't get the $1,000. People who live in a high-set Queenslander, very much a Queensland thing, the bottom floor of their houses got flooded, they could not get the $1,000. They had furniture, they had washing machines, they had dryers, they had fridges, all sorts of things. They could not get the $1,000. They were not eligible. The Prime Minister changed the rules by Twitter. Well, that's nice, but Centrelink don't get Twitter. Mould was going to be included.
Roger.
There's a whole gap in this bureaucracy, and this is what's just annoying, quite frankly. I'll just put it out on the table. There's a line of businesses in Townsville, Charters Towers, Huon, Richmond, Julia Creek and Cloncurry, possibly some in Mount Isa, but more in the 800 and 900 kilometres in between, that haven't had water go through their premises. Yet while they support their lovely staff, and we do, go home, do what you've got to do for your family. Be safe. Don't be out in the field, do that job. Don't drive that car. Be safe. But while you sit there and get your $1,000 and everyone gets their nice little piece of bureaucracy, small businesses a gap, and the people that didn't get the water through their building did not get a cent.
Okay, Linda, I'll have to... Okay, quick response because we have other questions.
I've got to completely refute what Cathy said. I was here with the Prime Minister. It was raised with us on the first night we were here. So it was a cute line about Twitter, but that night we got onto Michael Keenan and to Centrelink and it was changed. So the next morning we changed it from being flood, whether it was over or under the water boards. Cathy, that was changed and you know it was changed the next day. 87,000 claims have now been processed here and most of them were done in the first week. So we've got over $100 million into people's pockets. So that simply wasn't true. And in relation to the small business grants, well, first of all, you haven't rung me about it. But secondly, as you well know, it's the Queensland government. We give the money to the Queensland government. So it's a bit duplicitous to say, or to intimate that it was the federal government.
Okay, all right.
But the Queensland government have worked very closely
we've got
with
that point. You want to come in, but there's a question that's actually directed to you, so we'll go to that. Cameron Hitchcock has a question.
I was born here in Townsville 14 years ago, and I've been interested in weather, climate, and natural disasters since I was 3. I've already lived through the devastation of Cyclone Yasi and now the recent monsoon and flood disaster. Climate science clearly shows that the incidence of extreme weather events has increased. To my west, thousands of drought-affected cattle have drowned. To my east, the Great Barrier Reef is warming up and dying. But to my south, the government is supporting the Adani coal mine. And this is all just where I live, let alone the rest of the planet. How am I, as a student interested in history, geography, and science, meant to understand the inaction and ignorance of past and current generations making decisions about my future.
Steve Williams.
Thanks very much for that excellent question, Cameron. I was trying to make a comment a second ago, and Tony rightly let you ask that question because it was directly what I wanted to comment on. I guess I was going to put out a comment and a challenge to our governments, both current and future, and that's that we're talking a lot about reacting to one of these disasters, whether it's a flood, a fire, a cyclone. How about dealing with the actual cause of the problem, actually doing something positive about climate change like the whole world needs? And that's exactly the question that Cameron's addressing.
Jane, how does this look to you? And
Okay.
if what Stephen is saying is right, what climate science is telling you, these 1 in 500 year events may happen more frequently. Could you survive another one of these?
So thanks, Cameron, for your question as well. I have a challenge here. This is really about our economy, and it's about the economics and the future of Australia. So we have a lot of man-made disasters. We've got roads and railway lines that have caused a moat, and when they let go, that water is increasing every time we rebuild it, and we don't build it so that it doesn't happen again. So at the moment, we're rebuilding the railway line and we're rebuilding the road that goes west, but we're not changing it, we're just building another moat so that when the water lets go next time, it'll flood again. The railway line will go out, a train will tip over, the largest phosphate mine in the southern hemisphere is going to go out of production again, and we've done nothing to fix it. So it's really interesting. So then we've got houses here in Townsville, and I feel really sorry for you guys here in Townsville because there's a lot of houses and businesses built in flood areas. They're known flood areas. We've got no cattle in our national parks. They're not grazed anymore. We're locking up country. We're shutting country down so that the army can go and train in it. It's no longer cattle country. They can't coexist, apparently, which is a really shame. So it's creating these catastrophic events. The bushfires in Tasmania, and there would be more bushfires, but we haven't had any rain.
Do you accept what the scientists are saying about it being caused by climate change due to human-induced greenhouse gases?
Well, I'm in the cattle industry, so we live very green where we are, and we have frogs, and we've got cattle, and we've got green grass, and we're healthy, and we're surviving. So if you live in the city, everyone has a shower once a day. I remember when my grandmother was on the land, it was nothing to save water and for 5 people to bath in the bath water because there wasn't any water and it was a valuable resource. So, are our cities overdeveloping? Are we building more water resources to support our cities?
And is climate change causing extreme weather events that are killing your cattle? That's a question, I suppose.
But has this occurred before and we don't know? Is it recorded? Because the internet only started 50 years ago.
Stephen, do you know the answer to that? Has it happened before? I mean, have we just not been watching and these same events, the same frequency and the same intensity have been happening?
No, I mean, the effects of climate change on these kind of extreme events is not, it's not a theory. It's not just someone's idea. This is based on solid data. There's literally now no doubt that the climate is changing. There is literally now no doubt that it is humans that are causing it. We've been plotting the trajectory of both change in the past and trying to make solid predictions about the future now, as I said, for about 30 years. And of course, those projections are getting better and better. They're not perfect, but they've still been pretty damn good so far. And we are going to see more of this.
But are you surprised? I mean, if you're right, if this event was caused by, likely caused by one of the extreme weather events caused by climate change, does it worry you at all that the people most affected don't necessarily agree with you?
Well, I think actually there's been a big shift in that sort of opinion over the last year. I mean, you've now got farmers' federations or farmers' associations advertising on TV that they need to do something about climate change. We've got the school kids striking. You know, go for it, kids. I think it was fantastic. There has been a real shift, and I think that some of the politicians who are now, they're really looking like out-of-date dinosaurs in trying to maintain that kind of a policy. And I think the political climate is also shifting.
Do you think that's true, Linda, the political climate shifting? Because you've just thrown out a couple of prime ministers over these issues.
Look, first of all, I'd like to say to Cameron, thank you very much for your question, and I love your passion and I love your commitment. In relation to how many students here went on strike and did the protest on? A few in the audience? Well, can I say I love your passion and I love your commitment, and it's great that you're engaging in our democracy and having your say about climate change. But I think what we're missing is what I'm now responsible for, is what we do about it. And I think Jane has just raised some really valid points. Look, personally, I think the climate is changing. I've been around this country and seen all sorts of natural disasters that have been, in our lifetime, unprecedented. But the real question is, what do we do about it? So my responsibility is not in terms of carbon emissions. My responsibility is, how do we look at the dumb things that we've done to make it worse, but also how do we make ourselves more resilient? How do we make sure that we don't build houses in floodplains, or we build them that are not high enough? How do we make sure that the roads and the infrastructure we build doesn't get washed away every time we get
Linda,
flooded?
I'm going to have to give
so those are the important things.
The other side of the panel to answer, and Cathy and Roger.
Well, Tony, I'm actually a great believer in prevention and early intervention rather than reaction after the event. So climate change is real. There is scientific evidence that says very clearly climate change is real. We do have members in our government who are still saying that they don't believe in climate change. This city, this state, this nation deserves a government that has a plan and a vision for the future. We cannot address climate change project by project. It's simply not possible. We have no plan, we have no vision. We've lost a couple of
part of Labor's plan, because it's part of your plan, to build the Adani mine?
It's Labor, and I have always said...
Very good question. Very good question.
It is a good question.
Cathy can enlighten us.
And I have been very clear on this. If it stacks up, it stacks up. I have said in the most recent times the consistent changing of the goalposts is not helping this city for jobs or for investment from other people who may want to invest in Queensland or this city.
So is that a yes or a no, Cathy?
What I have said is it is not
Cathy,
for me
can I just pause
say.
you there, because we've got a question for you on this subject. I'm going to go to Kevin Gietzel. Kevin?
Yes, thank you. Cathy, my question is, your electioneering ads around town indicate that you're all about jobs, jobs, jobs. Yet it was only recently after the CFMEU threatened to withdraw their financial support that you reluctantly came out to support Adani if the project stacks up financially and environmentally. If you are so serious about jobs for our community and Adani failed to get their project across the line, what further support do you intend to give to try to help them to get this project off the ground?
Well, what I can say is there was no support withdrawn from the CFMEU to me. The conversation that I have had, or the point that I made in most recent times, I have spent half my working life in small business. I know what it's like to fight in an environment that is constantly changing. People in the north do not like people in the southeast telling us what we can and can't do.
Does that include Bill Shorten? Because
yes, I have said this.
He doesn't seem to think it stacks up. And if he becomes the Prime Minister, what are you going to do? That's really the point of the question.
I have said very clearly in the Batman by-election that people in the north do not take kindly to being told what we can and can't have. The other point I would like to make is it is not a wise community that invests all its eggs in one basket.
Tell me this, is it a big enough issue, do you feel strongly enough about it that if the leadership of your party didn't agree, you'd go to the crossbench?
I don't think we'll get to that point, Tony, but what I will say is I have been elected, and it's a privilege for me to be elected to this community to represent everybody in this community. My own personal views have little to nothing to do with this. I take my job very seriously. I speak to lots of people in this community on every side and every facet of this particular issue. My job is to make sure that a voice gets to Canberra that is relevant to this community. That is why I fought for infrastructure for stage 2 of the water security, jobs in infrastructure. That is why Labor again was first to the table with the port expansion project. Jobs again. Okay. That is why we have funded or put money on the table for energy infrastructure. It's not an election broadcast at this time.
Thanks, Tony.
Roger, I'd like to hear your perspective on this because obviously you've seen this massive event. You've heard what the scientist on our panel is saying. What do you think?
Okay, so 2 very short questions from you two at the far end, and then I'll answer.
So, no, you're not allowed to ask questions. Sorry about that.
Isn't that just laugh? Rightio, you ready?
You can certainly give us your opinion, or you can say it in a rhetorical way.
Oh, well, let's just point it out for the facts. Natural Resource Land Management Program, the NLP funding, has been cut in the 2019 to 2023 budget by 20%. Now, if we go back to the words of Advance Australia Fair, you'll remember a phrase or a sentence that says, our land abounds in nature's gifts, our beauty rich and rare. Ladies and gentlemen, you might think I'm being a joker, but what I'm saying to you is back to basics. The answer's in the bush, the answer's in the soil. Now, there are 5 users of landscape in Australia, okay? First of all, I'll point out, when I talk about the landscape, I'm talking about the rangelands. Ladies and gentlemen, did you know of the 765,612,700 hectares of Australia's mainland, 70% is the rangelands. It's not all about grazing. Our Indigenous people use that land. The miners use it. You use it in the form of society through national parks. If we increase the 535,928,890 hectares by 1% of carbon, well, just step back on my calculations and show you something. With 1 hectare of land, if you increase its soil carbon percentage by 1%, you increase its water holding capability by 470,000 litres. Now, you might agree with me or shake your head or not. I'll rhetorically point out...
You're going to have to come to your point, though, because we're just...
Right, it's the water cycle that matters more than the carbon cycle. Is that correct? Nod. Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, the carbon cycle is the front end of that. Okay.
All right, Roger, I'm afraid whilst it's fascinating, I think you might have lost a few of the viewers out there in the rest of the country. Now, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. It's time for one last question. It comes from Jai Philpotts. Thank you, Jai.
With the One Nation and Katter Party vote surging in the surrounding suburbs after the closure of Clive Palmer's nickel refinery, it reveals a dark glimpse into changes in voting behaviour after taking away people's hope. What are you politicians doing right now to help restore long-term hope for the ex-workers of the Yabuli nickel refinery? Is blaming your opponents and or doing nothing the best you've got?
OK, Cathy O'Toole, we'll hear from the politicians first, see how much time we've got. Keep it quick because we're running out of time.
That is a very good question, Jai, and I have met only 2 weeks ago with people who still do not have a secure full-time job since losing their job at Queensland Nickel. The workers at Queensland Nickel have not been paid their full entitlements, some of them. That is why we have to look at not always investing all our eggs in one basket. We need a diversity of jobs. We need infrastructure that creates opportunities for our apprenticeships, our young people to be employed with 18% unemployment here in Townsville. We never should find ourselves in the same situation again where we rely on one billionaire for all of the jobs in this city. And I will
Cathy,
fight to ensure that doesn't happen.
Just a quick political point on this, because what Jai is saying is that what's driving voters to One Nation, to the smaller fractional parties, to Bob Katter, etc., is the fact that people are losing hope. We saw that with Donald Trump in the United States. Is that a phenomenon that politicians in the established parties are capable of dealing with?
I absolutely think that's something that we can deal with. What people want from their representative is a person who's a genuine human being who fights for their community. The number one issue here is jobs. That's it. And that's what I do every single day.
Okay.
When I'm in Canberra, it's about Townsville and this region.
Let's hear from the other panellists. Jane, what do you think about that? I mean, you would have seen the rise of One Nation, of Bob Katter's party, and there will be others.
Yeah, so I'm not a politician and I'm not aspiring to be one. But I think it's important that we are very proactive and not reactive. I think it's time we stop blaming people. I think we need to build our future. We need to encourage our children to live in rural and remote communities and be part of them. I think we need to start building our communities so that we are proud of them and we're proud to be Australians, because that's really important. So let's build Australia to build resilience with investment. We need to invest in Australia.
Steve, what do you think about the fracturing of politics because people are losing hope at a certain level?
Yes, and I mean, I guess from my point of view and my field, the things that I'm concerned about is because nothing seems to be getting done about dealing with the root cause of the problem, of all of these things that we've been talking about. And in the words of actually Malcolm Fraser, former Prime Minister, he actually made a comment one time that the climate is a bit too important to constantly put it on the back burner because of the economy. Because the fact is that if we ignore the climate, the economy's going to go down the tubes.
Roger, brief comment.
Just a very brief one.
Without a theory.
No theories. Look, we keep it rational. I agree with that if we sit from move policy from now on to develop the future of Australia and look after the land, we'd be better off.
And Linda?
We started off talking about mutual respect, and I think that is very important, but it's also about balanced debate, I think, as everybody on the panel has said. And we do have to look at a balanced debate. How do we better live within the environment that we've got, respecting mining, agriculture, and also the environment itself? And that comes from respectful debate, and also it comes from balanced debate.
I'm going to go back to Jai for a final word. Jai, stand up for a sec for us, will you? Did your question actually get answered to your satisfaction?
Well, it's the best answer I'm going to get, isn't it?
OK. With that metaphorical egging, that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Linda Reynolds, Stephen Williams, Jane McMillan, Cathy O'Toole and Roger Hill. Thank you very much. A special thanks to this wonderful audience, Townsville Basketball Stadium, ABC Townsville, and all the great people in this tropical city who made tonight possible. Give yourselves a huge round of applause if you wouldn't mind. Thank you very much. Now, if you want to join the discussion and have your say, go to our Facebook page. Next week on Q&A, American feminist writer Roxanne Gay, small business minister and government MP Craig Laundy, who's just announced his retirement, the Shadow Minister for Environment, Water and Citizenship, Tony Burke, New South Wales Green Senator Marine Faruqi, and Liberal Party Vice President Tina McQueen. Until next week and the aftermath of the New South Wales election, good night.